on to seeded plants, and actually we're going to ignore gymnosperms and just focus on angiosperms, which are the most derived and diverse group of plants on the planet. So just kind of to introduce them, I wanted to talk about a pressing environmental issue, which is that honeybees, which are vital to the pollination or the reproduction of flowering plants, or many flowering plants, but certainly not all of them, are in decline, and it's thought that an overuse of pesticides has caused their decline. And in some areas, even in China, honeybees are extinct. And so for crops, for fruit crops, which are angiosperms, flowering plants, the pollination has to be done by hand, and they do it with these little paintbrushes, which they dip in pollen that they've collected, and they have to hand pollinate their flowering plants for their fruit trees. So pollination, angiosperms are very important to our food crops because of the fruit that they make, and the evolution with bees is a very important part of their reproductive life cycle, at least most of them. So this is an example of what we call co-evolution, where the evolution of two species is linked. The mutualistic relationship between the bees and the flowering plants. The plants rely on the bees for pollination, and the bees eat the nectar or pollen in the different types of flowers. This can, of course, lead to evolution and also lead to speciation. So bilateral flowers, which are flowers that are not radial in their symmetry, are more efficient at pollinating and evolved structures to increase that efficiency. So you can see on this bilateral flower, it has created these anthers to be curved around and place pollen specifically on parts of the bee, which in a normal flower aren't as specific. So this is a very specific selection, which leads to a diversity of species where they can specify on many different resources in their environment. So there's also some more dramatic examples of this, including the Darwin moth and the Darwin orchid. The moth has an unusually long proboscis, which is the same length or slightly shorter than the pollen tube of this orchid. And it got that way because of this co-evolutionary arms race, where it started out to have maybe a short pollen tube, and the moth also had a shorter proboscis. But successful plants had longer pollen tubes, which forced the moth to go deeper into the plant to get more pollen on it, and so it was more effective in its pollination. And the moths, in response, grew, or as a population, were selected for longer proboscises. And so it went back and forth until you have this unusually long nectary and unusually long proboscis. And this is found in Madagascar. It's called Darwin's moth. All right, so some of the characteristics of these angiosperms. The phylum is officially known as Anthophyta, but it's commonly known as flowering plants, which produce flowers and fruits. There are more than 250,000 species, and 90% of all plants are flowering plants. They have specialized flowers for reproduction for many different types of flowers, but generally the showy ones are the ones to attract pollinators. They can have up to 4 rings of modified leaves or organs, which attach to a receptacle, and those are the sepals, which kind of look like leaves, green generally. petals, which are brightly colored. Then you have stamens, which produce the microspores, which hold the sperm, and carpels, which produce the megaspores, which produce the eggs. Complete flowers have all 4 basic floral regions, but not all flowers have all 4. So some of them will lack sepals, such as this one. This one just has petals. Some may have anthers or carpels, but not both. And they are also arranged in sometimes in different arrangements on their stalk, and that cluster of flowers is called an inflorescence. All right, so the stamens produce the microspores that develop into pollen grains. They have the male gametophytes, and their structures include the filament, which is the stalk, and the anther, which contains 4 microsporangia. You can see that this is a cross section here. And each anther divides into 4 microsporangia, which contain diploid microsporocytes. Okay, so micro is referring to the male part, macro is referring to the female parts. The microsporocytes undergo meiosis and create 4 haploid microspores. We saw those in lab last semester. Each microspore gives rise to a haploid gametophyte. So some of these terms are familiar, and some of these are new. The microspores give rise to 2 cells through meiosis, the generative cell and the tube cell. And the generative cell and tube cell and the spore wall constitute what's called a pollen grain. And the tube cell surrounds the generative cell in the pollen grain. So here's a pollen grain, tube cell, and generative cell. The carpels produce the megaspores and female gametophytes. The stigma is the top part, which is sticky, where the pollen sticks to. The style is the stalk, and the ovary holds the ovules, which hold the megasporocytes. So within each ovule is a diploid tissue called a megasporangium. Within the megasporangium are megasporocytes. They undergo meiosis and give rise to 4 megaspores, of which only 1 survives. The megaspore goes through 3 rounds of mitosis without cytokinesis, so it has a bunch of nuclei, 8 nuclei within what's called the embryo sac. 2 of those 8 are called synergids, and they sandwich the egg, which is one of the 8, so that's 3, and help attract the pollen tube to the embryo sac. There are 3 on the other side over here, which are called antipodal cells. They don't know what their function is. And then 2 polar nuclei share the cytoplasm of the large central cell. Okay, so here's your antipodals, 2 synergids, egg cell, and your central cell with the polar nuclei. Okay, so we've got our microsporocytes with the microspores going through meiosis and then mitosis to form pollen grains. You have the ovule, which has the megaspore, which goes through meiosis to create 4 megaspores, one of which survives, goes through mitosis, and creates those 8 nuclei. All right, so pollination occurs. We've talked about this a lot already. Can be by wind, water, or animals. Generally insects, and there are a bunch of different methods. So some of these flowers will attract flies by smelling like rotting things. Some of them will be large, which will produce pollen for food for the bats. Of course, there are some that mimic bees, and actually bees will try to mate with them, and that's how the pollen is transferred. Hummingbirds as well. And the fertilization event then is a dual process. So angiosperms have this unique process which is called double fertilization. What happens is there are 2 sperm within the pollen. The pollen, when it lands on the stigma, forms a pollen tube, which then goes around and into the micropyle. One of those sperms fertilizes the egg, and the other one fertilizes the polar nuclei. And then the polar nuclei becomes the nutrients to supply what's needed for the zygote, which is essentially what I'm saying here. So the pollen grain consists of the tube cell and generative cell. After landing on the stigma, this pollen tube forms, grows towards the ovules through the micropyle. 2 sperm flow down the pollen tube. One fertilizes the egg to make the zygote. The other fertilizes the 2 polar nuclei, creating a triploid. Okay, so it's not going to actually become anything as far as the organism is concerned, but it gives rise to the endosperm, which gives nutrients to the fertilized egg. The ovule then develops into a seed, and the ovary develops into the fruit. And the embryo and the seed stockpiles nutrients such as carbs and lipids, so that after dispersal, there are nutrients available for the growing and germinating plant. The seed is where the zygote develops. The zygote develops into a seed. You have this suspensor here, which anchors the embryo into the plant. The endosperm provides the nutrients. The cotyledons are the precursors to the leaves, and they also provide nutrients to the plant. The shoot apex becomes the stem right here. So these are the where the apical meristems are located for the shoots and the roots. And after maturing, the seed will go into dormancy until conditions improve, so usually over winter. Fruits are a mature ovary and their other flowering parts. After an ovule is fertilized by sperm, the ovary and other flower parts mature into fruit, and there are a lot of different kinds of fruits, which we'll go over in a second. Some of these can be for protection, so they may have some parts on them which make them inedible. Some of them also may be for dispersal, so these get caught by the wind to help them go further away. So this one's for wind. Some of them are dispersed by animals by sticking onto them as they pass by. All right, there are lots of different types of fruits. We have fleshy fruits, dry fruits, such as this milkweed plant. There are berries, which contain the seed within them. Drupes, which have a hard pit. And aggregate fruit, which is actually a bunch of seeds, so actually are blackberries, raspberries, and huckleberries, things like that are aggregate fruits. You have legumes, which have peas and the seeds in a larger pod. Samaras, which were the winged ones, you see these on maple trees, and multiple fruits, which are kind of similar to aggregate fruits. Each one of these has its own flower and creates its own fruit, such as pineapple. All right, so that completes the angiosperm life cycle. We'll spend a couple days on this in class.